Hey everybody, my name is Isaac Terex, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make this meshed RBD Pyro simulation. So what you're seeing here is this is a Pyro simulation that I did in Houdini that grows up and fills its bounding box. And then I meshed it inside of Houdini and ran it through a bullet simulation, a rigid body simulation, and that allows it, as it grows, to kind of, you can see it a little bit more in the back end. As it shrinks, it kind of keeps itself upright and kind of bounces around as it shrinks back down. It was then brought in as an alembic into Cinema 4D, and I textured and rendered it using Octane Render. So I'll also go over this texture that I made here and how I set that up inside of Octane. So if we jump inside Houdini here and we just have a blank scene, the first thing we're going to want to do is make a sphere, and this is going to be what we emit from. We're just going to call this RBD AVC. So that's just our rigid body alembic, which is everything's going to be done inside of this one geometry. So we're going to set this to polygon and just give it some more polys to work with, because we're going to be deforming this. So after you do that, you can just right away just give it some normals. And then the first thing we're going to do is going to add a mountain node. This is, if you're coming from Cinema, this is the same. It's just a displacement. It just has its own noise already put in and a few parameters to mess with, so it's just an easy way of doing that. You could do it with attribute VOPs and the position and everything and noise inside of there, but for right now, we don't need anything that complex, so I'm just going to do this. We're going to animate the height on here and also the time. So the height is just, as you can see, just how high the noise is. These elements sort of add to how fine, how large this is. Don't need to mess with any of those, just if you've never used it. And then the time is really going to be what gives us this animated look. So it's the same as adding time to noises in Cinema, or if you're even coming from After Effects, it's the same as the evolution that you can give like a noise inside of there. So we're actually going to bring this down to 0.2, and we're going to alt-click here, and that sets it there. So I've actually had a few people ask this, that I found out that if you click this, it says Bezier, and if you click it again, it shows you the number. So if you accidentally get it stuck here and you're like, where are all of my values, just click that again and you'll get it back. So you can set that there, 0.2. Then we go out to frame 17. These are just ones that I know works for how I grew and shrunk mine. You can set these to anything. These are just arbitrary, and you can kind of do whatever you want when you build it your way, but these are just what I did for mine. So then I set this back up to its full value there, and it stays grown. So if we play that back, we just get this simple, just a lot more displacement. And you can tell that right now it's jaggedy, and you could add more here in the frequency, and that would help define that. I'm just going to do it later because I just was running quickly with this, and I wanted it to just roughly show me what was going to happen. Then I'll smooth it out with like a sub-D node later. So back here, we're going to go back to frame 1, and we're going to add an expression in the time. So we're going to do $F, and that's just calling up the frame number, and then we're going to divide it by 80. This is also, you can click that to know your expression and the value that it's writing out. So that allows us to get this animated displacement. And the reason that it's divided by 80 is it's calling up the frame number, which will slowly increase over time. So that's 87 divided by 80, and we get a little bit more than 1. So if we go back here to 80, it's exactly 1. So that's just a simple way. If we go in here and we bring this down to just 2, so we're just cutting it in half, it's going to be really fast. And that's just not at all what I want. So I'm just going to put this back to 80. We should be good. So just play around with those. You can change really a lot of the look. And the reason that we're doing this is because this sphere right here is going to drive the smoke simulation, and we're going to be shooting out the velocity based on the normals. So the more displacement this has, it's just going to break up instead of it just being, just a sphere where it all shoots out directly from the normals. This kind of breaks it up, so it's shooting out in different angles, and that animation on the displacement, just gives it a little bit more interesting of a look. Cool. So after we do that, we can add a transform node, and this is going to be another way that we're going to add even more variety to it. I'm just going to name this wiggle R, because we're going to be adding a wiggle into the rotation. And this is actually something I struggled with a lot when I was trying to figure it out. I just wanted, like in After Effects or Cinema 4D, in After Effects you would just write a wiggle expression in there, and it's pretty easy because you just do the value you want by time, and then in Cinema you just add a vibrate tag, and the vibrate tag is a little unpredictable, but it's an easy way of just getting random rotation. And I tried a lot of things, doing big, long, complex expressions inside of each one of these, and nothing was working, and it's because I was using the wrong tool for the job. It's not an expression, it's actually motion effects. And my friend Chris, some of you may know him as Tokyo Megaplex, told me, dude, you're just doing it wrong, just use motion effects, and right in there it has a noise. And when you do that, everything goes crazy, and you're like, what am I looking at? I'm in a different view, where'd all my nodes go? There's a graph, what is this for? But it's all super simple. So you don't really have to worry about these much. All we're going to be working in is the noise. So what it did was it took the rotation, and you can see it here, wiggle R Z, wiggle R Y, wiggle R X. So there's all of our values, and these are they'll be going up to 5 or down to -5, or beyond it a little bit there. And that's due to our amplitude, which we'll mess around with later. So if you bring this down, you can see these numbers start to shrink and the space between them. And when you bring it all the way down to 0, there's no noise happening at all. So if you bring it back up, to say 100, you can see it's now 50 and 50. So there's a lot of noise happening in the values. So first we're going to change this just to this other noise. I just like the shape of it and how I was getting it. Really play around with these. They all give you, they are all sort of similar to other noises that you've seen, like alligator, everything like that. You can see alligator just wants to go above and won't go negative, which is super helpful for a lot of things. It won't go to a negative value. You can make some other noises not go negative. It's just, by default, that's what it wants to do. Random is just, pretty chaotic. And you can also see it gets rid of a lot of things because it's a pretty simple noise, what it's doing. Other ones are a lot, so just play around with these, find the ones that work. This is the one that I found that worked best for me. And we're going to actually go in and change some values inside of here. So for the seed, that's already set as an expression. You don't have to mess with that. And then we're just going to want to go to the period and animate this up, animate the roughness. So you can see what roughness is doing. It adds more jagged parts to it, and as you bring it down, it smooths out. So it'll be a lot smoother transition between this random noise. So all of these, period, roughness, and amplitude, are going to help us, along with the displacement growing up. We're going to want to add the rotation to grow as well. We're also going to add another transform that scales up the sphere, and those three working in tandem are really going to give us a really unique and varied result. So this emitter looks different, and it's just kind of a way of faking like that growth look just through a few parameters. So for period 1, we're going to want to set this keyframed on frame 1. Then again, we're going to want to go out to frame 17 and just bring this down 0.75, which crunches in, kind of compresses in the noise per frame. So these are your frames down here, and you can see as it went down, we kind of crunched it in a little bit so there'll be more noise. It'll be kind of faster. I'll click there, set a keyframe. Then we're going to want to go out to frame 38, and again, crunch it in again. So you can see a little bit tighter there. Then back out to frame 68, and we're going to let it go back to what it was. Cool. So we're going to go back to frame 1, and we're going to animate the roughness. So there's going to be no roughness on the first frame. And instead of typing in 17 and then 38 and 68, we can just, because we already have these keyframes for another value, you can just jump back out to them. So back here, we're going to go 0.1, alt-click, jump out to the next one, 0.4. So we're slowly adding more detail to the noise of the rotation, and then we're going to bring it off again. Cool. We're going to go back to frame 1. The last one is amplitude. So I really want to drive this, as to wiggle more as it goes up. So we're going to go 0 there, and just as it comes up, this is just how mine looks, and you could obviously change this and have it grow in a different speed or a lot faster. So we want to go 38, get it up to its maximum, so it's 50 plus and 50 minus, and so that's a lot. It can go almost 90 degrees in a rotation, and so if you did say want to do a 180, you would just have to double this so it could go 180 up and 180 down. So you'd want to put 360 in there, but for this 100 was fine. And then bring it all the way off at frame 68. So what does this look like? And you can close this now. We're not going to be animating anything. It's the same as this, you just don't have the graph. So if we go back here, that's our random rotation, and then it stops. So it just goes up and it gives a little bit of twisting and shaking, and then it stops. So if we go up from this, so you're just in one, you can see it made a little node for itself called the chop network. And so what we're doing inside of Motion Effects is using the chop network, kind of like a DOP or a SOP or anything. It's just chops network. So you dive in, you can mess with these again if you want to get back there. I'm just going to put it next to this transform to know what's happening. Actually, before that, I'm going to add another transform. Append it in between. It's called a scale up. Go back here. And this is just going to move our sphere up and scale it up at the same time to help with the growth looking effect. And as it's doing that, we're going to want to wiggle it. So we go up here. I'm just going to do the uniform scale because I don't need it to, just stretch in any specific way. I just need it to, generally scale. So I'm going to go 0.2, so it's pretty small, and go out to frame 17 and bring it up to 1. Go out to frame 97, put it at 2.5. So it's getting really big, and we can just alt right click and zoom out of there. And then we're going to go out to frame 166. These are, again, just arbitrary values that I found worked. And bring it back down to 0.2. So it's small again. At the same time that we do that, we're going to want to move it up. So this is kind of a way of cheating that it's staying on sort of a level playing field and growing up. You could use an expression to kind of be half of whatever the uniform scale is, and that would keep its middle point there. Probably be smarter, but just for this, there's a few simple keyframes to keep it in position. So in the translate Y, which is the middle, I'm going to put it to negative 2.2. So it's going to be way down there. And if you alt-click just in the single box, it won't add keyframes to all of them because you don't need it for the X or Y, or the X and Z. You just need it in Y. So that's another little gotcha that I ran into. Then we can go here to frame 17, just 9, alt-click there, go out to frame 97, bring it up to 0, and out to 166, and we can bring it right back down. So actually lower than we were before. So with all of those working in tandem and the wiggle, we can do this. And then it shrinks back down without any wiggle. So you get that wiggle rotation. Actually, let's see what it looks like if we do it in the opposite order. So bring that here into the scale. Okay, I actually like that better. So it's rotating, because the rotation coming after was a little bit odd. So we're going to scale it after. Bring that up there. Cool. So that's everything you need for there. We're going to add then a subdivide node. And just have that set to 1, just to help with smoothing it out. So you can see it looks a lot better there if we turn it off. Really jagged, popping, and that just helps smooth it out. Cool. So that's everything there. And then after all of that, I'm just gonna, again, just recalculate the normals and make sure they're all fine. And just line these up again. Cool. So that's everybody there. That's kind of the first stage of just building how our emitter is gonna move. And now we can start messing around with how we're going to add some attributes for the Pyro smoke sim to work with. So after this, we can add a attribute rename right up here. Drop it down. And this is where we're going to take N to V. So if we go in here, this allows you to just say, look at this attribute from and rename it to this. So right now we don't have a velocity attribute, I don't think. If we go middle mouse on there, you can see there's no velocity. So if we go N, which is our normals, and we rename that to V and check here, then we do. We have V in normals. Great. So then we can, after that, we can bring up a Pyro source. And this is coming from the Intagma guys. I love their tutorials. I've learned pretty much everything I know about Houdini, or a large majority of it, from them. And this is, the way that they set up this smoke simulation, and that's kind of just what I followed, because they're really smart guys and they know what they're doing. So definitely check this out and check out their entire catalog. If you are new to Houdini, or even if you've been using it for a long time, I'm sure there's stuff for everybody at every skill level. They're extremely smart dudes. But yeah, so I'm using kind of the setup they've used in this video because I thought it was applicable to what I wanted to use here. So if we append this, and that's kind of their choice, was to just reuse the normals. I was like, that makes a ton of sense. That's what I'm going to do. And so the Pyro source, if we grow this up a little bit, is taking that and making points that the volume or the Pyro simulation can use later. And it's really smart, and it's all new, and they explain it really well of what exactly it's doing, but just know that this is a really good method. But the only thing that I'm going to be doing different than what they were doing is using a surface scatter instead. Because my sphere is growing, I want, as it grows, the particles to just scatter on top of the surface. So you can see down here, there's less particles, and as it grows up, there's more particles added to kind of keep the same distance as particle separation on the surface. And if you switch this back to the default, which is keep input, when you're way down here, it's doing it just based off it. So if there's a lot of polys, there's a lot of really tight together particles, and as it grows up, they kind of expand out to what its bigger shape is. I didn't really want that because I knew my shape was going to be growing, so I would do this, and then I just have to set the particle separation to about half of that, so they're a little more dense, so there's more information. So when it's down here, they're dense, but it's proportionate to the scale of the object that we're working with, and that's what I wanted. So then the next thing, you just have to add add some values. So we're going to add 2. And you don't really have to write anything. It's just density and then our newly created velocity. So that the Pyro solver can read these and they're assigned. Then the next thing that we have to do is just use a volume rasterize attributes, not rasterize, just volume rasterize attributes. And you can kind of tell from the icon, if you can see that, it's particles and they're becoming a volume. So that's what this is doing. And you can append it there. And then we just have to tell it what we want it to, bring over attributes-wise. So density is definitely one, and then velocity. And you can see it now. So once we've told it what we want it to do, that's good enough. You don't really have to mess with anything else. It just knows, okay, you're bringing over density and velocity, and those will then be carried over to the Pyro simulation. And this is just kind of showing you what it looks like as, a volume or a fog. Cool. So that's everything there. And then we can just, now that we're done with this section, just add a null. I'm just going to color this orange so that I can see them. We're just going to call this smoke out. Pen that. And we're all good. So that's all the setup that is required to take it into the Pyro solver and do that simulation. And then once it's done, the result from the Pyro simulation is going to be brought back out here and ran meshed, and then run that meshed solve into a rigid body. So it's kind of like a 3-stage thing. So that's the first stage, and we're all done with that. So then we can drop down a DOP network right inside of here. I didn't know you could do this until later, but you can, and it makes it a lot easier so you're not jumping right back out here. I'm sure there's some cases where you need to do that and keep them separate. And when you definitely use the shelf tools, it wants to bring them out here and separate them and import them. But this is easy because you just wire it in, and this is just, you can hover over and see that's input 1. So when we come inside here, we just have an output because we didn't use any shelf tools, but our setup is really simple. We just need smoke object. And right away, just because I know the size of my things, I'm going to want this to be 4 times as big as it is. I'm just going to bring this down a little bit. This is the resolution. So when I did, my final simulation was at 0.02, but it took a while. So I'm just going to bring this back up to half its default size, and that should play fairly fast for us. We're then also going to need our source. So we're just going to bring in a volume source. This is asking us what is the SOP path, but we can actually just say it's the first context geometry because we plugged it in up here into the first input. That's all we need to say there. And then inside of here, we need operations, and we need 3 of them. So we can just add 3 of those. And this looks really, daunting and complex, and it's definitely, they explain it, the entitlement guys do, exactly what's happening when you add all of these. But essentially, you're just adding, you're mapping those attributes that you brought in. So because we brought in density and velocity, we're going to definitely need 2. And the third one is going to be saying, hey, take our density and target it to the temperature. And that's just something that the Pyro solver needs. So right away, we're just going to say, this doesn't actually need to be a scalar, it needs to be a vector because we're going to first map in our velocity. So the name is just v, and this is vel. And then when we go here, the operation by default is add. We're just going to make that copy. You could use add, it's just I wanted to use copy, and I definitely played around probably like 30% of this whole setup just in here of figuring out how I wanted to map these going into the Pyro solver. And then all the other, another 30% was just spent, we're just going to bring it down now, in the Pyro solver, in the simulation settings, messing in here, and a lot of time in the shape settings. And this will detect, direct how your sim should look. So definitely play with these, definitely look at them, turn some on, turn some off, really see what's happening. And same with here. And that's, the best way that you can just, rather than mimic one look, you can kind of, direct how you want it to look. You can go, oh, I need actually more shredding, less turbulence because I want it to be, a little bit less crazy as it goes out and to be a little bit more flowy. You can turn that down. I don't want it to, by default, lift up. I want to kill this down, and maybe it goes sideways actually as its buoyancy. So those are settings you're just going to have to play with. And I would definitely suggest looking in the help document. They really explain in detail what all of those are doing. So they can say it way better than I can. I'm just going to show you what I did to get the look that we're after here. So in the volume source, we need to set up the rest of this. So that's all good, and then the scale. By default is 1, so it's just going to bring it over. But if you want to kind of ramp it up, and have more velocity per, the attribute you brought in, you can animate this value and it works. And that's kind of how I directed how the smoke simulation reacted inside of it. So if we go back, and I'm just going to turn off this brain, and this is really handy for going through the timeline, even if you're in something like a dot network that needs to think about when you're going forward. You can just turn that off and set your keyframes. I do that a lot, and then I bring it back, and then I simulate, and I see how it's looking, and I shut it off, and it's just a faster way of doing it. Cool. So once we have that set, I'm going to animate these, and by default, I'm just going to set it right away to 10, just because I want 10 times the amount of power that it was coming in before. And then I'm going to, again, go out to frame 17, double that. So as it's growing up, you can remember back that our sphere is now scaling. So we want, be pumping out, now twice the amount, or 20 times the amount. We can go back out to frame 96. And you can tell that all these keyframes are in the general vicinity of other ones that we've set. And that's just because I want them all to be happening relative to each other. Looking back in hindsight, I probably would have driven these, by a master kind of growth arc and keyframes, so that I didn't have to, remember 97, and then one, another one here, and then another one 144, and that's when it falls off. When I was building it, that seemed like the fastest run and gun solution, but going back and kind of making it a little bit more easier and elegant probably would have remapped a standard growth animation to all of these values, and that would have been a lot easier to manage. So just a fair warning, probably if you want to set this up for your own thing, I would do that route. Cool, so now we're at frame 96, and we're going to want to bring this down, because I want a little bit of it, to start just not really cranking outside of the volume. I want it to kind of just be creating enough velocity that it's, shooting out from the sphere and filling up the box. Then we can go to frame 130, bring that up a little bit, and then out to frame 137. And here we're going to really blast it out a bunch. And then at 144, it's going to die off. Back down again. Cool. So that's our first operation. Our next one actually is scalar, and it's going to just be the density. Just going to copy that, paste it again. Just also wants it just to go to the density. The add is right for this one, and we're also going to animate the density scale. So if we go back to, we've actually adjusted that there. We don't want that. Let's make sure that it didn't totally map those off. It did. Oh, that's an oopsie. So that's going to be 10 on frame 1. Oh, okay. Just going to Command C. So I did do it right. So frame 1 has that. Frame 17, 20. Okay. So we're back at frame 1, and for density scale, we're going to want this to be 30 times its default amount, and then we're just going to green arrow forward to our next keyframe, because these are all going to be tied together. Actually bring this down so it gets a little bit thinner. Out to the next one. This is going to go back halfway in between the two. Going to go out to 130. Going to bring it down a lot. Then 137, and it jumps all the way back up to its maximum that it was before. Then 144, it's back down to 1. Cool. So that's looking good. And then this last one is just density. Just paste it to temperature. And I didn't animate this at all. So now that we have that, that's all set up, and we can port this into the last. And we can take our smoke object and put it in the first. And we can port this into the output. And if we turn our brain back on, go up a level, and look here, it's disappeared. What's happened? It's because our smoke here is low, and then when we go inside, we can see this object. That's its bounding box. We made it 4 times the normal size. That's its bounding box. And so right now, our emitter and everything is just sitting outside the bounding box. And I wanted this because I wanted it to kind of grow up out of nowhere. I didn't want there to be a default sphere. And I'm sure that this is, sort of a backwards, weird way of doing it. It was just the fastest way I could think of doing it. So it's going to slowly come into the bounding box, and that's how it's going to start. So if we go back to the output, we can go up here. We're just going to start and see what. So it's it comes up, and we have our sphere, and it's making smoke, and it's filling up this box. And when it hits the edges, because it's the bounding box of the simulation, that's where we get our box shape from. It's actually a pretty crude way of doing it, but this is just like, it's fast. It's just a box, so it fills up a box, and that's where you get the shape from. And the later ones that I did, it was a sphere, and that was just a collision object inside of this, and that had a few more things going on, but just for the simple one, it just fills up the bounding box. So then all of our other things are going to come from here. So time scale was fine, temperature diffusion is fine. The cooling rate, though, I brought this down, and I did this because I wanted it 0.1, which is a lot less than its default. And I just didn't want it to, evaporate as quickly as it was. So if we play this again, see a little bit of a difference. It's just going to kind of hang out a little bit longer than before. Unless I have this completely backwards and it actually dissipates faster. It actually looks like I have it backwards. So let's go back up to 75, or back up to 9. Well, I think I am correct. So cooling rate, you can actually, on here, go to the help. If you're confused about something like that, like I am, where you're just like, I'm not really sure what's exactly happening. So the hard thing is you can't do help per thing that I found yet, but if you do this, the node, you can scroll down. Cooling rate, how fast the temperature field cools to 0. So a value of 0.9 will decrease the temperature of hot gas by 90%. So I brought that down. And then viscosity, I brought that up just a little bit, 0.65, just so it's a little bit more flowy and less turbulent and crazy looking, and you can mess around with those to see what's happening. And another one of the things that I used inside of here was just messing with the buoyancy lift. So I didn't want any, because by default 5 is kind of, it's going to want it to go out, and I wanted this to be downwards. So it's almost like faking gravity, because I have no gravity node down here. It's just like faking that force. So buoyancy lift, we're going to animate this as well. I'm going to turn off the brain. Going to set a keyframe there. And then we can go out to frame 61, actually. And I'm going to actually set the keyframe there, because I want it 0 for that long amount of time. And then go out to frame 79 and do 2.5. So what this is going to do is essentially it's like in 0 gravity all the way up until 61. And then it starts to slowly let it fall down, because that's, our y direction negative. So it's going to slowly let it kind of like cascade off. And that took a little bit of a while to figure out what that look was. You could change it a lot and make it go, any direction that you wanted, like I said. This was just what I set it to. Cool, so once we're in there, we can go to shape, or go check that off. I didn't use combustion at all. This I just left on by default, a lot of trial and error. Then shredding, sharpening, turbulence. Shredding was just brought down. Sharpening was fine, and turbulence brought up. And then down here is all of the fine controls for those. So it didn't do anything there, or here, or there. It was all in the turbulence. So the swirl size is quite big, actually. For this scale of what I was doing, I'm sure it's fine for other things. And that's something that up here in the pyro effects. So these sort of things where it's like candle, or billowy smoke, or wispy smoke, that kind of sets this look up. So playing with those is where I found with the look that I wanted. So I would really encourage you to, just use these shelf tools, and it starts a sim just for you, just automatically, and you can kind of see what's happening in each one, and you can start to know what these settings look like at different scales with different effects going on. So you can know, oh, I want a little bit more billowy smoke, and I remember that this was a certain value, or wispy smoke was a certain value down here, so I need to bring that down. So definitely play with those. You can really start to art direct what your simulation is going to start to look like without having to do as much, push and pull of these settings. So in turbulence, I just know that I want to bring this down a lot. So it's 0.025, so it's a really small swirl size. And then anything else inside of here I didn't really mess with, and it was just turbulence, so I wanted more of it. And that was everything. That was all the settings that I did, and then advanced, just use OpenCL. That was it. Cool. So now if we go back, we turn this on, this will look a lot more like the simulation in the scene. So you can see it kind of coming out. These are its little legs that it generates, just because it's shooting out from the sphere. You can kind of see it there. And as it grows up, it starts to hit these walls and makes our general shape. And so this is kind of just what it looks like. This is just everything, and then it fills it up. And you can kind of see these little holes. It's hard to see because it's all volume, but once you see this mesh, it will make a lot more sense. And we're out to 97, so we know something's going to happen because we set a lot of keyframes there. If we pause this right now, zoom around, you can see this is kind of where you get that crazy looking shape. Because we've now hit the walls and the object is definitely bigger than this bounding box, we get these cool, weird patterns that are happening internally from the smoke simulation. And if you just pan around, it's kind of hard to see here, but you'll see it more when we mesh it. And this is something that I was really interested in. It's technically wrong. You don't really want to hit the bounding box of your smoke simulation and keep doing stuff that's normally like a cardinal sin is seeing the edge of the bounding box. Just for this thing, it wasn't supposed to be a smoke simulation. You weren't supposed to really know what it was. It's just this weird organic thing growing, and I liked kind of this weird thing that happened when I hit the bounding box and there was still smoke just kind of doing its own thing inside and running off the simulation. So that's, this is the main look for what's going on. And the cool thing is when we mesh this, you get all these integral little caves inside of it. And when you use a SSS material, you really can kind of see that detail inside of it like you can here. And so that's exactly what's happening. All these weird little divots and everything, these parts that are chunked out, and all that you can see inside is just happening because this is the bounding box of the smoke simulation, and this is just internal smoke stuff that's going on. So as it kind of scales up, we're doing additional scaling afterwards of the meshed version, but as it scales up, you can see it's now hitting the walls of the bounding box, and the smoke's slowly filling it up, and then it scales up, and it just keeps hitting them. When it fades away, it does this even crazier stuff. So if we let this simulation keep going, it's going to slowly start, because we're shrinking down our emitter, it doesn't have enough to fill up the whole bounding box anymore. It's actually getting smaller. So you can see this is the sphere sitting inside, but it has this cool just residue almost that it's hanging on to the bounding box because it's shrinking faster than it's, doing anything else, and you just get this cool stuff that starts to happen. Cool. So that's kind of the explanation of what's happening there. And then that's everything. So if we go up, I'm going to make a DOP import, output. And you're like, and I thought that I could just plug this into the next thing, and I'm sure I could, but I wanted to bring in these fields, and maybe you can in here. But I couldn't find out how to do that. Maybe if we try this. Density and B. I wonder if I can do this. And then a points from volume. So this is where we're going to start meshing it. Do points from volume. And we're going to set it to fog. And it doesn't seem to work. Okay. Just like I thought. Weird. So instead, it's not anything different. It's just not a continuous thing. So we're going to, tell it which dot network that we want, which is just, this one, and I'm going to rename this to smoke dot network. So it's easier to tell because we're going to have another one. And it renames it there automatically. And what we want from inside of that smoke dot network is the smoke object. And then we're going to bring in some fields. We're going to bring in, nope, just two. Density and the velocity. Bring that into here. And you can see now we have these points that are now making up our volume. So we go back in, you can see this kind of crazy. And we don't want it to be set to grid, or I just didn't like the look that grid was doing. So instead, I want to set it to tetrahedral, and then add the jitter scale to 1. And that kind of helps break it up so it's not a perfect grid, because this is an organic shape, and when we mesh it later with the VDB, it's just going to look a little bit better. You could just use this because its volumes already use the volumes. I just liked the look that this points from volume is doing, and then bring it back into VDB to help just kind of break it up like this, because before it has voxels and it's fog, so it's already in that sort of like grid. This is the way I did it. There's a million ways to do anything inside of Houdini, especially when it comes to like meshing and simulation. So this was the method that I used, and I kind of liked the look that it produced. So after you make these points, we're going to need VDB from particles. And inside of here, before we go into it and make it, we're just going to want to change a few things just off the bat. So we're going to want to first bring this down. And I'm going to, what I used for my simulation was 0.01. So we're probably just going to go up a little bit to 0.5. Let's go down, just to kind of show you that some things in this simulation are going to take a little bit longer, especially with the meshing. So surface is fine. Then we're going to want to go down to the point radius scale and the minimum. And we're just going to want to change these. So this I'm going to bring down to match that. And this I'm going to bring down to 1. So once we click this, it's going to have to think about it a little bit. And you get this. So these are volume. These are making little tiny, what we're used to when we're working with VDBs, based off the particle. And I just realized that when we did our simulation, we brought up the scale. So these are all tied to one another, and you could, again, link them with expressions. I just know it worked for mine. So when we go back in here, I'm actually going to set this division size as 0.1. So we'll probably want to match these to 0.1. And it disappears because your point radius, it can't be smaller. So we bring this back up. There. It's got to be a little bit bigger. So it's really, really chunky and not that detail that we wanted because it's matching that other, size. So when you definitely, it takes a bit of time. When you do your smoke simulation finally, I would bring that down. So maybe if we do 0.05 right now, bring it back. Go up here, keep it there, and just simulate for a couple frames. You can definitely tell there's a lot more detail in there. And then we would go up, and we go back to here. We can start adjusting these. So 0.05, so you can see those are getting smaller. 0.06, or if we can do 0.05 as well. 0.05, It doesn't like being a matching scale. So yeah, I would definitely want to bring that down. And you can tell it's almost a perfect sphere, because you just get a lot more resolution out of it. But we're going to need to keep this up. It'll probably be a lot faster for us. And then you can, these will all, that's the only one that you have to really change there as you go through. and then adjust everything else accordingly to get the right shaping so there's not gaps in between. So we've made now a VDB from that, and the next thing we want to do is go and just resample this. So we can use a VDB resample. Because this was so crazy high when I was doing my sim, I just wanted to take something and resample it using the voxel size. So this is a really handy thing. So it looks it's not much information there. If you bring this down to 0.1, you're getting a lot more information side of it. It's 0.05, and it looks the same as it did before. So for this, I actually brought it up to 2.5. But that's, if this number was 0.01, this would be, almost, a little more than twice the size. So if we're at 0.05, we're going to want to bring this to 0.1. And that just helps, smooth everything out and make it look more like a solid object. And once we do that, we can then go off to add a dilate, which is in the VDB reshape, SDF. We go in here, and now it really looks smooth because we're dilating it by 1. If we erode it by 1, it's going to shrink inside. So I'm going to set that to dilate. Just dilate with an offset of 1. And then, after that, we're going to smooth it. So it's going to be VDB smooth SDF. We want to set this not from there, but to mean curvature flow. I just like the look that was giving. And this down, not doing much, just a 1. So you can tell it's kind of smoothing it all out. It looks really blobby just for, our simulation. But the nice thing is, because these are all linked together, if you start going forward, it's doing the smoke simulation, bringing this in, making particles out of it, and then doing all these things on top of it. And because our settings are, 5 times higher than what I was doing, it's actually pretty responsive. So you can start to see exactly what your growth is going to look like, which is really nice. And you can already kind of tell what the shape is going to do. Next, after that, we can just convert this. Convert VDB. And we're just going to set this to polygons. So this is our meshing. It's pretty easy. And this is, now that it's a mesh, we can bring it into that RBD sim and start to mess with it there. So once we do that, we're just going to make a null. Make it orange. And call this mesh out. Cool. And slowly going off to the left there, so I'm just going to hit out. Just aligns everything. Oh, it seems to have brought all that up, which I don't quite want. I'm going to bring that back up to the wiggle. So once we have that, we can call it mesh out. And now, before we bring it in to do the rigid body simulation on top of it, I want to do a little bit extra now that we have this mesh. So first, we're going to want to make a transform and wire that in. And this is going to be called scale up. This is our, we already have a scale up, but because it's down here, we won't really get them confused. Inside of the scale up, we're going to be animating the uniform scale again to kind of reinforce this growth. Because once I did the first one, I was like, it's actually a lot bigger than I wanted it to be. I'm just going to redo it now that we have this. So on the first frame, I'm going to turn off the brain so it doesn't have to actually make it, and we can see it later. So the first frame is going to be half the size that it is now. And then it grows up all the way to frame 111. Keeps growing. And this is just happening because it already did that calculation. You can see in blue there. You're not actually simming it. Then you can bring this back up, and I'm going to make it 3 times as big as it was. And then at frame 125, I'm going to keep it at that size so it stays up there for a little bit. And then 240, which is the very end now, I'm going to shrink it back down to 1. So if we did this whole sim, you would be able to see it kind of actually do this afterwards. So it's really small, and it's scaling up, up and up and up. And it will scale all the way up to being 3 times its size for a little bit and then, you know, fall back down. So it's just kind of reinforcing that growth effect. Another thing that I did was, because I knew it was going into a rigid body, I started it already a little rotated, just so it would have a little bit of, you know, interaction. So because it's flat and the box that's, you know, the bounding box is flat and it's on a flat surface, it's not really going to look that dynamic. It's going to look like we're scaling. So I gave it a little bit of rotation, so it's a little off kilter when it first starts, and it gets dropped down, and it kind of like settles itself as it's growing up to give it a little bit more life to it. Cool. So now that we have all those going, I'm going to turn off the brain again. We're going to add some secondary things. So we come out and give it a little bit so we can see what we're doing. Turn that off again. Zoom in. We're going to go up and we're going to add mountain node again. Just going to add a little bit of detail back on top. So we're going to copy this 3 times. And remember, this mesh quality is driven completely because of the size of everything that we're doing doing the whole simulation at. So it looks, you know, there's kind of low poly, and that's going to affect how we use these. We could add, you know, a subdivision after this and then a smooth, but just know that once you set these up for your final settings for your sim, all of this will look a lot better. So we're going to call this large, call this medium, and call this small. So we're going to stack these on top of each other. I'm sure there's, you know, a more procedural way of doing this, but this is just what worked for me. So we're going to wire those all into each other. And for the first big one, you can see it's already really affecting it a lot. So we're going to set this to, you know, 0.05, and we're going to just not change anything about any of these sides, and we're not giving it an animated evolution over time. It's just a purely deform a little bit. This is a lot more prevalent when, actually, let's see if we do that so we'll see what we're doing. Subdivide in front of that. Just crank it up a little bit. This is going to be a lot more like the mesh that you're using. So if we turn this off, you get a little bit of noise there. And then we're going to go up here to the medium, which is crazy again. And we're going to take that height and put it at 0.05. And we're going to bring the element size down to 0.5. So it's making it a lot finer detail. We're going to go finally to the small. We're going to bring this to 0.025 and this to 0.25. So these are just levels of that. It's kind of subtle. Definitely could be done in texture. It was just something I liked playing around with, and I liked how it gave it a little bit of uneven displacement on top of the already sim that we were doing. Great. So once we do that, we can add a normals to recalculate. Cool. And I'm actually going to shut off this subdivide. Just delete it. And then we're going to make another null. 2 RBD out. Probably add 2 RBD out, so we can just tell what's happening. And set that to orange as well. Cool. So now, once we have all of that, we can bring it into the Dotnet that we create and do a simulation on it. But actually, before we do that, we can see it's below this ground plane. And this grid right here is where the ground plane is going to be. So just because I know that, we're just going to bring this up again, just so that it has, and we can actually, if you're in this mode, you can cycle with the numbers and see exactly if it's, you know, doing that correctly. So now we know it's going to not, you know, be inside of the ground plane. We're just going to bring it up there so it can drop on top of it. Cool. Now we make a dot network. Call this rigid body dynamics dot network. And I'm not going to plug this in because when we go inside, I'm going to make a rigid body object. And we're just going to tell it where it's going. This is another way you can do that. So we don't want mesh out. We want, where would it be? 2 RBD. Cool. We're going to click those on. Use deforming geometry, and use object transformation. And that's going to take the transform that we had that's doing the scales, and we're going to take the deforming geometry so it thinks about it every frame as, it's going to change. So those were big, key moments for me of like, oh wow, you can do a simulation with something that's growing, and it will actually take it into consideration. The other thing we're going to need is a ground plane. And that needs a static solver. Just going to wire those up. We're going to need a merge to bring these two together, and a rigid body solver. So this is gray, just goes in there, gray goes in there, and just wire those up. I wire that to the out, hit L, everybody's lined up. Cool. And this already knows what it's going to. You can, I guess if you want, change this sort of settings. I don't think I changed them at all. You can change grid size and everything. Cool. So if we go up, we go out here, everything is set up correctly. And now inside of here, you can see in the collisions, this was something else kind of gotcha that I ran into. I thought we were using volume-based collision, but that's for an RBD solver. Actually, what we're using is the bullet data. And because we're using the bullet data, it's going to use convex hull, even though it's the second tab, because this is by default set to bullet. Bullet's a lot faster, but I just found in the second time I did this with the sphere, when I used RBD as the solver, and I used this method instead, it was a lot more responsive because it was actually, making a lot more detailed collision geometry versus the bullet, which was making the most simple form that it could for the bullet, as well as even if you switch this and you're like, great, I'm using this stuff and that all looks right, you're still set to bullet. You have to switch that over to RBD. So that was a gotcha that I ran into that I just didn't really see it because normally I was messing with these settings. So we have our brain off. So if we go back to 1, turn that back on, and go forward, we have a growing mesh, and it's growing, and when it hits that, it's going to, not go through it, which is, right. It's staying with it, but it's not really falling like we wanted it to. That's because we need a gravity node at the end of this. A gravity force. And default's fine. Unless we wanted to animate it, and then we'd probably want, to set that to always and stuff, but I just wanted it to drop down. So now we sort of, get the result that we were looking for, and it hit it, but it's, it's not really rocking or anything. So if we go inside of here, and we have all of that, we turn the display geometry off, we go to bullet data, and we show guide. This is the shape that it's making. And that is, not exactly what our smoke looked like. And so instead of using bullet, if we go back to the first frame, you would want to set this to RBD if you want a really detailed collision. So if we go up here, and we see that we're using this, and we have that checked on, so this is going to show us once it creates it, instead of using bullet data, which was making that sort of like just really low poly shape, and really didn't see like the little details that were coming out. And for this, I didn't want it to really bounce around and everything, which is typical of when you have a growing shape. It kind of like a leg sticks out and it doesn't want to collide, so it kind of pops it back up. So I just a little bit of rotation stiffness, not much bounce, and a little bit of friction. And then the other thing I had to set was inside of here, I brought these up to double what they were, just to help with the collisions, because it's going to be kind of poking through, and I didn't want it to do that. And I got a little bit of seeping into the floor. So, and then I also use volume velocity for collisions. I can't really tell you what exactly this does. It just makes sure, it says it determines if the changes to the volumetric representation will be used in the collision resolution. So yeah, so essentially if you check this on, it will not just kind of sink into the floor. It will realize that it has a new volume, a new shape, and kind of make sure it stays above your collision object. So we play this now. You can see it's kind of popping around, but it's, you know, it's reacting to the shape as it grows, which is really cool. And it's not really sinking through the floor. It's just kind of, you know, off center now. And in comparison, if you set this to bullet, go back over here, and you go up and you use the collision and you look at bullet, you're at this convex hull, and we show that geometry, and we hide this. This is the shape that you're going to get, which is kind of cool. It's just pretty flat, and it doesn't really respond that well to the growing shape is what I found, which was kind of annoying. So in my later sphere test, I used the actual RBD solver, and that worked a lot better than the bullet. But the bullet is a lot faster. So that's all the settings you really have to do inside of here. I would mess with them to get the look that you want. I'm going to display that geometry and shut off this geometry. And that's all that I really did. The big thing was using deforming geometry and figuring out the right kind of collision shape that I wanted to be generated, and that was volume. That really showed these intricate little tiny parts of the sphere as it grew. So we go up, just do a null, wire that in, call this ABC out, make it orange. Actually, we're going to want to not show this, so don't display the proxy geometry. We just know that it's there. We come out, ABC out, play forward, we get our object. So once I have this ABC out, null, you can just go up, and the easiest way for no one that's ever done it before like me was the alembic, and you can set the file path where you want to save it. The only thing is you have to write .abc after the name that you give it for it to write it as that file type. And then I just did the range, and that's all I want was this, so I accepted the pattern. The asterisk means it's just going to bring everything that it can, but we really only have one. It's just good to know for the future. If you just want to bring one specific thing, you can't just accept the pattern. It will only bring that one object. So once we export that, and it takes a long time, and you get your beautiful detailed mesh, you're going to want to texture, light it, and render it so that other people can bask in its glory. So that's what we do inside of here in Sim 4D. This is our object. So once it comes in as the alembic file, I just added a subd on top. You could do this inside of Houdini. I just, I didn't want it to always be this subdivided, so I wanted the control just inside of here to be able to turn it off and not have to see it so subdivided. So that's why I did it in here instead of inside of Houdini, bringing it over. And it's a pretty simple scene. I just have this camera, which I added handheld animation to. Then if we go out of this camera, you can just see the whole scene is just a sweep, and it's all entirely being lit by one HDRI that's like, slightly rotated a little bit. And this HDRI actually comes from Maxime Roz. These are incredible HDRIs. I can't, suggest these enough. He has this entire free pack, which is incidentally where this one is from, but I've bought another one of them. But this is just like, he does an amazing job of capturing the light data. They're super crisp. The locations are great. I've actually fell into the habit of just using his for a lot of my stuff, but just buy all of these packs. They're really great. You can see other people have used them. It's all in Gumroad, and it supports him. so that he can make more. And when you go into the info on his blog, he kind of breaks down exactly how he goes about this and the different color spaces that he uses. And it gets very technical, and I don't understand a lot of it. But this is where I'm using this HRI, and I suggest that you all pick them up because they're just great and amazing and a great resource to have. And yeah, so back inside of here, that's all just being lit from the side through one of those. This is a pedestal scan that I found a long time ago on like Sketchfab or something, and it has just a basic little tiny texture on top of it, some roughness. That's not really that important to this look. You can use whatever. I just like to kind of set up, when I do these little Houdini tests, just set it up with a little bit of a scene around it, just to help, make it a little bit more than just like this growing on a completely black background or something. And so the sweep, just there, nothing fancy, pedestal, scan with the smoothing on it. But the really important thing that most people are always like, how did you get this, jello, weird skin looking effect? So if we load this into Octane, it's pretty heavy because it's completely a glass surface, a specular material, using 100% real SSS inside of it. And that's where you get this coloring when the light comes through. It's all being calculated in that one material. There's nothing else going on. And a lot of what helps it and why I use SSS is because of all these crazy caves that are being made inside of the geometry. I really wanted a way to show that. So if this was all metal, you'd never even be able to tell other than just like the sides that it's doing that. And I thought that was the coolest part of this whole thing of, not using a smoke sim the way that you should and kind of like letting it hit the bounding box and everything. So this was the easiest way to show it, and it's a pretty simple setup when you dive into the graph. It's just these two things. There's a marble noise with some triplanar projections. Scale is animated up, so as this grows, this marble scale grows with it. So it seems really small in the beginning and grows up so that it doesn't seem like it's slipping on top of it. And then it just has a blend, and it's checked to use this one for all of them. Then it just goes into the bump on top of it. And then the rest of the effect is done in the scattering medium. So these settings also took a little bit of playing with. It's very dependent on your scene scale. So this scene is all built to life scale. I found out in my other life size SSS settings that, when I do liquids or like beer, the density is normally only 70. So this is really high in comparison to that. The first one here is a very light touch of the overall color, and you can see how drastic it is there. It's because our density is really high. So it's just, a little bit of orange, 3% there, almost 100% there. Just, these values have to be really low when you're giving it a lot of density. And then in the scattering, this value means there's only like 21%, so 1 would mean it's almost completely scattered inside and it would look a lot more like a solid object. So it's, only 21% of that, and it's being given 100% of this blue, this like dark navy blue color, and that's really what contributes to when it gets up here, you get into the scattering, it's mixing with the red, and it gives this like purple look to it, which I thought was really cool. So if we actually load this up, and it's gonna, pardon, I'm just running on one 1080 Ti at the moment, so it's gonna be, a little heavy for it. So if we select a small render region, and we go inside these settings, I'm gonna find a way to show both. And if I change this scattering color, you can watch there, so I'm going to select inside of that so you can compare to the outsides. And we go over to something like green. You can see how drastic that scattering really affects it. So this is, helping that internal just give it a little bit more detail. So the more the light is scattered inside, like this, the more crazy it's going to look, and that's getting it more of like a solid shape so you can't see through it as much as you could before. If you bring that down to say something like 5, it doesn't, matter that much because you're not really using it that much. So it's a balancing act of these. So if we bring it back to 21, and we bring it over to something, like it was before. And I just think this is really a beautiful secondary touch, and it kind of helped. I wasn't going for a flesh look, but you can see how this can add to flesh and kind of give like an internal veins system to it, and really just helps that look along. So just bring that back to there, and you can see this is only at 3% of its saturation. This goes all the way up. You get this crazy, crazy dark red look, but I wanted to show the variation between the thicknesses, so I brought this down just so that when it comes to an area where it's a lot thinner, you're not getting that saturation, but when you get into these really deep areas back here where it's pretty thick, you can see the full saturation of it. That's also a balancing act with this value, so you bring this back to 100. It's not showing up, and so I just kept bringing this up until I could see that value. But you could also, on the flip side of that, start to bring this up instead. Maybe it's not that extreme. Maybe it's a little less. And so you're still kind of getting the same effect. It's it's a little bit clearer there and a lot darker back there. I just like to normally keep these at low values and then multiply it back in the density of how dense I want to make it. And that's it really. The roughness inside of here is just barely enough to kind of help along the scattering. So you bring that down completely down somewhere like there. It's all being driven then by the scattering, but if you just bring this up to 0.1, you get this really kind of jello-y, rubbery look. So I just wanted to help that out a little bit, but still give it kind of a sheen when it was caught by lights and everything else. The fake shadows I turned on just to help these back parts let less shadow through, more light through. So that's technically not 100% accurate, but just gotta use the settings for the scene that you have. So pause this. It's all just path tracing because I was using the specular material. It's not too high there, the specular depth and everything. I clamped the GI by quite a bit because I didn't really need that much of it bouncing around inside, and it was getting a little bit noisy, so I just brought that down. And I brought this down to half the normal so that I could get a little bit more information in the caustics. It's still quite blurry, so it was still running fast enough. And then I was using adaptive sampling, just arbitrary values that I found worked for mine where they didn't really compromise the quality of the render. And I always use static noise just because I don't do any post denoising or use Octane's denoising. I guess I could. I just tend to like just the static spots to stay in the same area instead of flickering around and adding like that grain sort of look. So that was everything. It's actually pretty responsive when we look at the density of it. Go back in. This is all from the meshing that we set up. These parts just stay where they are. They don't really fall off as soon as they're created. That's something in like a later exploration I would like to look into. So as those are created, they kind of become their own RBD objects and they collide with this and fall off. It would be interesting to see how that works. Another test I was trying to do was seeing how it looked with this being like a vellum soft body object or a fem object. It just takes quite a bit of time because of this growing effect and the points changing. They don't really like that when you're doing sort of vellum soft bodies, so that's something else to play with. But a lot of people are interested just in this look, and it's a pretty simple setup, so I thought I would kind of just show you exactly how I set it up. And in the description of this video, there will be a download link to my website and my freebies with the preview video of what it is and the download button where you can download the HIP file with notations. It will look something like this. So it's all broken up into those three main chunks that we went over. 4 main chunks that we went over with some notation explaining exactly what I said here in case you're going through and you're like, what is that setting? Why is that happening the way that it is? I hope that this was informative. Sorry for it being a little bit longer. I'll definitely release a TLDW video after this. That's the short 5 to 10 minute video without all the explanation behind it. If you just want to watch that instead, or you just need a little key bit, I'm also going to start to time code my videos so that you can kind of click around to the exact time codes. So if you're just looking for one specific thing and you're like, where did he add the pyro source with the one thing? You can jump right to it. So thank you for watching. Have fun creating and using this, and I hope that you learned something. If you did, share it with some friends, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.